Welcome to the Entrepreneurship Bootcamp introductory session. Getting to Investor Readiness is the program, and the idea is to teach you what you need to know to be able to talk to investors to raise money in a more challenging environment than ever. So thank you for coming. Hopefully lots of good information in here, and look forward to hearing what you think about what you're hearing as well. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to Runway for putting this on. Runway is a very cool and cutting-edge space in the Twitter building in downtown San Francisco. They provide all-inclusive workspace memberships. They do corporate innovation, lots of events, pitch events, networking events, parties. They provide services to entrepreneurs, to startups, to corporates, large enterprises, you name it. There's no better place in San Francisco to base yourself, whether virtually or physically, if you're in startup and growth mode. So thanks again to Runway for putting this on, much appreciated. A little bit about me. I've been in the Bay Area for a little more than a dozen years. I used to be the general manager of The Vault, a co-working space in the heart of San Francisco, and my time there brought me in contact with startups from all over the world. There's really nothing I haven't seen in the startup space, all the good, all the bad, all the right and all the wrong. And so I've tried to take that experience and turn it into some lessons about how to do things better going forward. I have a lot of operational experience, a lot of IP management, fundraising, foreign market entry, and so on. So I really enjoy working with young companies before they get sort of to their A round to help them create a more stable foundation and to be poised for growth once they do start raising money. And that is what brought us here today to this seminar. So we've put together a set of 7 courses. You can see here, module 1 through 7. Today is kind of a high-level introduction to what we're going to be talking about. The other topics you see there are all important. It's certainly not an exhaustive list of all the things you need to know when running a startup and turning it into a business, but these cover some pretty broad categories and we think are valuable. They're all valuable, really, but this is a way to understand the depth and breadth and the diversity of concerns you've got when you're trying to run a business, especially starting from zero, which is what a startup's all about. So today we're going to talk about the high-level stuff, and then in a week from today, in the value proposition module, we'll dig down into the value proposition. So let's hope everybody comes back for that one. So high-level considerations. Well, there are lots of them. I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that starting a startup is easy. Building a business is hard. And if you're intent on turning your startup into a real business, you have to approach it as a business and not as a startup. A lot of folks think a startup is simply a cool technology or an app or some service that they can offer the market and hope somebody will pay for it, and off they go. That might work at the very beginning, but before too long, if you're serious about building a real foundation, and if you're serious about raising money to help grow it, you're going to have to treat it as a real business. Most startup founders have never run a business before, therefore they're at something of a disadvantage when it comes to approaching investors. So the idea is you've got to at least familiarize yourself, if not actually master, a whole bunch of different topics in order to tell a credible story to an investor. Otherwise, you'll be seen as either too risky or too uninformed or simply not reliable enough to take their money and turn it into something larger. They're going to give you a certain pile of money. They like to get a larger pile back. They know the chances aren't great that that's going to happen, but it's your job to convince any investors you talk to that you have a better chance of doing that than anybody else they're talking to. So it's really important to keep the investor's primary focus in mind at all times when talking to them, because believe me, I've seen lots and lots of startups and entrepreneurs who tend to lose focus and talk more about themselves or how cool their thing is. It's not the way to do it. You've got to focus on the investor's priorities and concerns as a primary part of your pitch. Otherwise, they're not going to think you take them seriously enough, and they'll be much less inclined to trust you with their money. So never forget, an investor is investing in you to make money. They may like you, they may be friendly, you may enjoy hanging out and talking with them, but at the end of the day, they're in it to make money, and they're counting on you to make them that money, and they're choosing you over others. So it's a really important distinction to understand that an investor is paying an opportunity cost in going with you. That's possibly the highest level consideration of all. So today what we're going to look at is 4 things. The first one's going to be what it means to run a business. Again, something that most folks are not that familiar with, at least most young entrepreneurs won't have had the time and the experience to run a business for real. We're going to talk about what it means to be an entrepreneur and take a look at your understanding of entrepreneurial processes. We're going to talk about what it means to ask for other people's money, because that's what you're doing. You're asking for somebody else's money to do something you haven't done before, presumably, and that takes a lot. And then finally, we'll have a look at the various topics that you need to consider. It's about 20, 25 items. It's not everything, but it covers a pretty broad swath of what you need to know when running a business. It's both informative and intimidating because there's a lot there. And if you don't know it, you can look at this list and think, this is impossible. It's not, but it takes a lot of dedication, it takes a lot of learning. So don't be afraid to apply yourself when it comes to figuring out what you have to do, how do you prioritize it, and how do you execute it. So before we get started too deep into any of these specific topics, let's talk about what does it mean to be investor ready. Since I can't speak to you directly, I have the back and forth. I'll give you my definition of investor ready, because it's not something you hear about all that much. Investor readiness at the highest level means you are prepared to sit in front of an investor and tell a good story about the project that you're trying to turn into a business and the way it's going to grow and the assurances you can offer that their money is going to be safe inside your startup and it's going to grow into a larger pile that you can give back than they gave you in the first place. So investor readiness means you've, if not mastered, or at least fully familiar with all the different things that matter to an investor, not to mention to running a business, and that you can present those in a coherent, cohesive, and believable manner. If you can't, any good investor will pick you apart, and they may not show it, but in their head, they've probably turned off any inclination to go with you. So you've got to understand that there's a lot of different things to look at. Every investor is different. So investor readiness is something that you have to define for yourself and make clear to others that you consider yourself to be investor ready, and here's why. And then we start talking about these topics. So first topic is, what does it mean to run a business? Investors invest in businesses, not startups. Sure, it's a startup because it's a young company that may be pre-revenue or maybe still in the red, but eventually it's got to be a profitable business. Generally, it has to be a profitable business in order to provide value, to provide a return to your investors. The equation is very simple. They're giving you money, you're going to turn it into a big pile of money, and you're going to do that through the mechanism of a growing, sustainable, and profitable business. If you don't have that understanding, you can't convey that basic awareness of how the business world works, you've got a ways to go before you're going to raise the money. It's okay to be caught out talking to an investor and not have the answers. It's a great learning experience. Make sure you do learn from it. So when you sit there and talk about the ways you approach this business, make sure that they are aware of the time you've put in to master these topics. If you don't, then you're going to be caught out and have nowhere to go. So it's very important to master those. When talking to investors, you're convincing them that you understand enough about business and for them to trust you with their money. Now, if you think about it, if you've never run a business before, they're not going to have that much reason to trust you. But you've got to establish that trust, and you do that by showing the mastery of these topics and by an understanding of their criteria. Again, the top one is, are you going to make me money and not lose my money? That's the first thing to go after. But then some investors focus on some things like product market fit or traction or competitive positioning. Others focus strictly on the bottom line, on operating margin. It all depends. It's up to you to find out from those investors what they value, and therefore to have the ability to focus on the things that matter to them. You can't meet everyone's criteria every time, but you've got to be aware of who you're talking to, what they value, and how well you can meet their criteria. Don't forget, if they have criteria that you can't meet, just because they have money doesn't make them a good investor. You have to critique the investor as much as they're critiquing you. So you're running a real business. You're not just running a startup. As I said earlier, a startup is an early stage entity that doesn't have all the attributes of a business yet, but someday it's going to have to. In order to grow, when you get to an A round, a seed round certainly, but an A round definitely, you're going to have to show that you have all the structure that you expect to see in a business. And if you don't have that, then most serious investors will walk away. And there are stories of companies that, was it Pandora, I believe, the CEO took 250 tries, meetings with the venture capitalists to raise the money. And he finally did, but can you imagine, after 100 meetings, after 200 meetings, not raising any money? That's hard to imagine. I don't think I'd have that kind of tenacity. You might, but at some point you begin to wonder, am I telling the right kind of story here? So raising money, running a startup, these are very iterative processes. You want to make sure you're learning all the time from the feedback you get, whether it's in a pitch event or an interaction with a potential customer or hiring somebody. And if you're not getting where you want to get to, there's a reason. So make sure you pay attention. That's how businesses grow, by being aware of what's going on around you, by being cognizant that maybe your story isn't ideal and that you've got to find a different way to tell it, or tell a different story. Understand that running a business is very much a fluid exercise, at least at the early stages. Once you get bigger and get established and actually have some traction, then you'll find some more stability. But at the beginning, it's not like that. So you've got to demonstrate comfort with that uncertainty and that possible instability. These things will impress an investor if you acknowledge you don't have all the answers, or you need to go research something and to come back with a legitimate answer rather than trying to bluff your way through it. Any good investor will sniff out a bluff. So they want to see that you're real, that you're open, transparent, you're aware, and you're learning as you go. You're coachable as you go. These are very important things to understand how an investor views you when it comes to the proposition you're making to them, which is asking them with their money to do something you yourself may never have done before. And there's a lot of risk involved in something like that. In fact, risk is my particular favorite as topics. That's the second seminar. Next week is value proposition, then risk recognition and management. Startups are oftentimes an aggregation of novel risks, and you've got to find a way to characterize and manage them. And I think that's a real attribute, a really strong mindset to have about risk management, risk recognition, risk awareness. But that's for a later day. So once you figured out how you're going to tell the story of how you are or how you will be running a real business and not just a startup, it's time to talk about time to take a look at your understanding of what it means to be an entrepreneur. So entrepreneurship is very, very difficult. If it was easy, with all the startups out there, there'd be a lot more unicorns, there'd be a lot more successes than there are. There are still plenty of successes, to be sure, but there's also an awful lot of failures, as it should be, really. When people try new things, not everything can work, and things inevitably will fail. The important thing is that if you fail, that's one thing. If you're not learning from that failure, that's another thing altogether. As I say somewhat inelegantly, the only true failure is a failure to learn from a failure. So I think the first lesson for entrepreneurship and would-be entrepreneurs is that failure is an option. In fact, it's a likely option if you look at the numbers over, say, 3 to 5 years, the percentage of startups that fail, and you've got to be aware that that may happen to you, and how are you going to deal with it? There's lots of ways you can go about preparing, positioning yourself not to fail, but at some point, if failure is inevitable, what do you do? We're not going to talk about that today, but understand that managing success is one thing, managing failure is another, but equally important consideration to have. And I think a lot of startups just choose not to focus on the possibility of failure because they don't want to be seen as a failure. But again, the only true failure is a failure to learn from a failure. So there aren't that many born entrepreneurs. It's certainly a skill set that you can acquire. You can learn through experience, you can learn through example, you can learn by doing. There are people who've started many dozens of companies, some have started 1 or 2, and everything in between. And every conceivable type of success and failure is out there. So I think you need to really understand what are your motivations when it comes to starting a startup. Because when you're talking to an investor, if they have the experience that you'd expect them to have, they'll be able to sniff out your self-awareness about entrepreneurial processes and how well you fit the bill to be considered a real entrepreneur. Again, it's one thing to be ambitious and willing to work 20 hours a day and never say die. It's another to be intelligent and smart about what's working and what isn't. And if something's not working, do you pivot? Do you shut it down? You've got to consider all these options. And I think it's really helpful to show an investor that you understand that full range of outcomes and not to shy away from the bad ones, the failures, and not to say, I know it's going to work. I'm absolutely certain. That's going to make you look bad, because no one knows that. Nothing is ever really certain at the outset. Virtually all the big companies that are out there today succeeded in some measure. Not what they started out as, and oftentimes in spite of themselves, and made it eventually. And sometimes it takes months, years, or decades. You look at Apple and its journey, for example, what it's been through since the mid 70s when it was founded. Pretty remarkable story, and look where it is today. So what I'd like to do is in my normal class is run people through a series of questions to generate the self-awareness about how aware are they of their own entrepreneurial tendencies and their things they're born with, things that they can learn, habits they've developed that allow them to survive in an entrepreneurial environment. So, for example, how attached are you to your ideas? Startup is your baby. A lot of people are very, very attached to it, to the point of irrationality, where if somebody criticizes it or decides it's simply not worth the time of day, people get very, very upset about that, because they're like, well, it's my startup. How can you say that? It's my baby. You know, it's a great thing that I've built here. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Just because you think it is doesn't mean they do. But you've got to be aware that there's a lot of bias in being an entrepreneur, that you're often overly attached to your own ideas. You got to have some objectivity, be able to step back. And if somebody else doesn't appreciate the way you do, well, that's okay. It's a chance to learn, a chance to try to change their mind, and possibly to move on if it's not working. Can I take criticism? Can I get feedback that isn't very flattering? You watch Shark Tank and see the reaction of some of the people to negative feedback from some of the sharks. It's quite something to see. It's very educational. There'll be plenty of skeptics, no matter how good your idea is. There are always skeptics. So it's really good to be able to develop that thicker skin to avoid, looking like you're not suitably mature to handle criticism, or to take something in and process it and maybe come out with a clearer idea or a better path forward, whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. I've seen an awful lot of startups, an awful lot of founders take it personally. Don't make that mistake. You do not want to make the mistake of taking criticism about your company personally. If it's personal, you'll probably know it, and it rarely is. So at least that's a good thing. There's judgment. There's an awful lot of judgment needed all the time in running a startup. Am I doing the right thing? Is somebody else competing? Is there a competitor out there who's got more resources than I have, better market positioning, better offering? How do I make decisions about keeping going? How do I, if I have to pivot, what does it take to get me to realize, okay, what we're doing simply isn't working. We've spent 3/4 of the money we raised. Can we do a pivot with the 25% we've got left? Or do we simply shut it down and return what we can to the investors? They certainly understand that day may come. You need to understand it as well. Well, again, one of the fundamental aspects of entrepreneurship is realizing that it's not going to go the way you think. And if it's not going the way you think and you have to shut it down, well, take that on as seriously as you take on managing excessive growth. There's everything you do, you've got to do with the same degree of rigor and focus and integrity. Otherwise, things can get sloppy towards the end. You don't want that to happen. You don't want to leave. You don't want to burn any bridges. You don't want people thinking that, well, you just gave up and walked away, or you just didn't care how it ended. It's still their money that you've got a little bit of left. So you've really got to show that you're able to carry this through all the way to whatever end, whether it's a future funding round, acquisition, or failure. And that's a really, really critical aspect of entrepreneurship. There's an awful lot of process to go through. Again, not just the process of running a business, but of maintaining proper view of how your entity is evolving, how the competitors are evolving, and what does that do to your place in the landscape. I mean, if you have a competitor, you guys are roughly the same in size or in scope or in market, and all of a sudden they get investment by Amazon, and all of a sudden they've got Amazon's capabilities behind it. That probably changes pretty considerably the nature of that competitor relative to you. What do? Do you keep going as you were going before? Do you look for a similar backer to Amazon, in as much as there aren't that many like that? What do you do? I mean, this is where you get a chance to exercise judgment and deliberation over a change in the market that you have no control over. The only thing you can control is your reaction to it. I've seen an awful lot of startups that simply have no idea how to react to competitive moves that put them at a disadvantage. So be prepared to watch the landscape, to be aware of what's happening as best you can. because you can never know everything that goes on out there, and how you're going to adapt to it. We talk a lot about this in the risk portion of these seminars, because risk is fundamental to managing any company of any age, but certainly most prominently in the startup phase, when a few poorly managed risks can be the end of your venture, and maybe needlessly so. So don't make that mistake. You really got to educate yourself about risk recognition, risk management in every way you can. And believe me, there's a lot of ways it can happen. So be aware. Be aware that's going to be a fundamental requirement, kind of a 24/7 risk radar that you've got to demonstrate about the world around you. Transparency is a big one. A lot of investors have gotten some ugly surprises. Look at WeWork, for example. If you want to see a catastrophic decline because of lack of awareness, lack of transparency, take a look at WeWork and what they did, and the monstrous loss in value as a result. I'm not saying you're going to be the next WeWork. I don't think you will be, and that's a good thing. But understand that practicing transparency at all times, at least as best you can, is really, really important. Transparency leads to a lack of surprises. And if there's one thing investors hate, it's surprises. You know, they never want to get the phone call, we're out of cash in 30 days, could you send us another $500,000? You never want to have to make that call. You want to keep tracking these things as you go from day one and understand the milestones you're hitting or not hitting, the progress you're making or not making, and how you're going to deal with it. They want to see that you understand that and you're willing and able to do it. That's critical to entrepreneurship, because again, there's more things that can go wrong than can go right. Probably 100 to 1 things that go wrong versus things that go right. So it's your job to manage these things, at least to be aware of them. If something happens and you just say, well, I didn't know, I didn't see it coming. And if you're the head of a small team, that excuse will not fly. So be aware that you need your own radar, and not to mention your team's radar, up and scanning all the time. However formally or informally you can manage that. Really critical to have a constant positioning and repositioning what's going on around you. Otherwise you might get caught off guard. You may have to surprise your investors, and that won't be good. That won't be good. And the last thing in this sort of entrepreneurial process is, what does it mean to ask someone else for their money? I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, but I think it's really, if you step back and think, when you were a kid and you asked your mom or your dad for some spending money, and they gave you $1 a week, $5 a week, that's modest, that's fine. You do what you want with it. But if one day you came in and said, I'd like $100, please. Understandably, they're going to say, what exactly are you going to do with this? Because you've changed the game, the nature of the game, and the relationship between you. Same thing with an investor. It's one thing to sit in front of an investor and say, do you like what I'm doing? It's another thing to say, I'd like to take $500,000 of your dollars and try to do something that I've never done before, and for which I can offer no guarantees, no insurance, no security, but I think it's a great idea, and I'd love it if you would join me in this journey. I've seen that pitch a million times, and generally it doesn't work that way. If you think about it, put yourself in an investor's position. That's the best thing you can do, really, is to understand the impact you make is put yourself in their position. And if you came to investor you and said, I'd like $500,000 of your dollars to do something, no security, no insurance, no guarantees, no prior experience, and in the face of substantial uncertainty with COVID out there and big competitors and dynamic landscapes and who knows what else might be a possible obstacle, how does that sound to you with your $500,000 in your pocket? You know, you could just put it in the bank and collect a modest, a small but guaranteed percentage on your money, or you could risk it with this person who has the nerve to say, hey, why don't you try something? Let's try this experiment together. My brains and your money were a great combination. Doesn't sound like a great deal, I have to say, and yet it does happen, happens all the time. So there must be a way that you as an entrepreneur, even without the experience and the assurance or guarantees or security for their money, can get them to believe in you to the point of giving you their money and trusting you to grow it. It's a great responsibility and it's a huge challenge, but it can be done, it can be met. The numbers aren't hard and fast, certainly. Anywhere between 50 and 90% of startups fail within 5 years. Those are terrible numbers. They're absolutely dreadful numbers. And yet, early stage investment continues through friends and family, through angel networks, through people willing to take the biggest risks of all in the hope of creating something that's stable enough to raise more money under less risk and a higher return. So it's your job to transform all these uncertainties and all these risks into something stable and sustainable and scalable that somebody else is going to believe in enough to keep investing in. So as I said at the outset, there's an opportunity cost that you're asking someone to pay for you. And that opportunity cost is pretty significant because, at least here in Northern California, every investor, every venture fund, every angel group is besieged with opportunities. And so in many ways, you coming into the mix and asking for someone's money at a pitch event or in a private meeting, however it's doing it, you're competing with a lot of other companies for that investor's attention. So you've got to show not only are you a safer risk than all the rest, but that you have, if you get their money, you've got the maturity, the education, the awareness to make sure you're safeguarding it at all times. There's so many ways for it to go wrong. You've got to be aware of what those are, and you've got to do your best to fight them off. It's really, if you think too deeply about it, it can make you crazy, and you won't want to do it at all. Don't do that. There's no need to make that mistake. But understand that you're signing up for something very, very different. When you take somebody else's money to pursue some vision that you have, that's just a totally different thing, a level of formality, a level of legal liability, a level of trust and transparency. These are the kind of things that too often entrepreneurs want to talk more about themselves and their cool project than they want to talk about the people they're asking to take substantial risks on them to make that project a reality. Don't make that mistake. Those people are generally, if not visibly, inside investors' head, there's just an X on that person's opportunity and they won't take it. You can usually tell by the questions that come out. So if anything, be humble, admit the uncertainties, talk about your openness and your willingness to be transparent, to be cooperative, to learn from others' experience, and I think you'll find a much better reception. Because again, at least in this part of the world, but I'm guessing in most parts of the world, investors have more to choose from than they can possibly invest in. Therefore, you've got, it's kind of a beauty contest, really. Investors are often looking for reasons not to invest in you. Because if you've got 2 or 3 opportunities of equal measure, if one's got a slight flaw, something an investor values that they don't see, they'll just move on. There's no need to take that slight flaw and factor it into the equation when the other companies don't have it. So you need to understand what those flaws might be and how do you eliminate them from your narrative. Because if you don't, then that may be it for you. It may not be a priority for somebody else, but at least you've lost that one. So I've seen that time and time again. It's really a tough one to figure out, but because early stage companies have so more gaps than structure, you've got to figure out a way to demonstrate you're going to fill in all those gaps, and before long, before those gaps have a chance to do real damage. One of the things you've got to be able to do is, let's say you're raising $500,000, $1 million, $2 million. That's not a big check by standards here, but it's still a lot of money for you to take in and spend wisely in pursuit of a particular outcome. So do you have a really detailed use of proceeds? I'm a big one for very detailed use of proceeds. I won't talk about it today, but I'll just say if your use of proceeds is a pie chart with 3 or 4 slices with some big percentages in there, most investors are going to think you haven't really done your homework in figuring out what am I spending on, what am I going to get, how am I going to track it, how am I going to reach a go no go decision if I'm spending 40% of my proceeds on software, who's doing it? Is it an in-house team? Am I outsourcing it? If I'm outsourcing it, am I able to keep an eye on them? Are there communication issues if they're overseas? There's so many uncertainties you introduce by outsourcing something. And in most companies, that's what they do. Most people around here don't hire large teams of software engineers, so they outsource it, but that's a whole different set of risks. You've got to show you understand them, you're aware of them, and you're prepared to offset them. If you don't, then you might be going down a rabbit hole from which there's eventually no escape. Lots of stories. I've run 2 businesses that both relied on outsourcing, and believe me, there's a lot more ways for things to go wrong than for things to go right. The only way they go right is if you keep a close enough eye to make sure they go right. So understand you're signing up for a lot of mundane oversight and accountability, but that's what keeps the world running. Oversight and accountability. It's certainly what keeps businesses going. So that's part of the responsibility you're assuming in becoming an entrepreneur and asking somebody else for their money. Let me finish the talk about the investors. Is on the beauty contest idea, every startup is risky for investors. It's your job to convince the investor that you are the least dangerous place for them to put their money at the present time. You've got to be the least dangerous place. And the way you do that is by showing them that you've done your homework about your product market fit, about your competitors, about market dynamics, about timelines and growth, about accessible markets. There's an awful lot you've got to figure out, but it can be done. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of iterations, takes a lot of feedback. You got to take in the feedback and process it and use your judgment about advice that's good versus advice that's not so good. You've got to position yourself as the least dangerous place, the least flawed startup for an investor to put their money into. That's the way you're going to get to the discussion about making a serious commitment investor to you. It's really, really important to do that. And I think humility and awareness and demonstrating you've spent the time to investigate all these things is really going to play well for you. I've seen so many companies that get tripped up by a simple question about a fundamental aspect of a business, and the investors just turn off, and they should. So don't make that mistake if you can help it. So what I'd like to do, as we're getting close to the end here, got about 8-9 minutes left, I have a list of some 20 topics that I think are at least, if not essential, at least well worth knowing about when it comes to running a business and the things you need to be able to answer to when it comes to talking to an investor. So this is not everything, certainly, but there's a lot here. The first being, the essence of entrepreneurship, as I've been talking about up to now. How do you convince somebody that you understand enough about being an entrepreneur that they're going to believe you, and you're going to be able to demonstrate it as you go? It's probably the softest of all the things you're trying to convince somebody. A spreadsheet with revenue forecasts and manufacturing costs is one thing, but convincing somebody that you understand entrepreneurship well enough to be worth their money is a different thing altogether. Team, of course, is critically important. If you've got a small team, 4 or 5, 6 people, and you hire somebody who turns out to be, kind of a lunatic, that can cause real damage to your company. Google can hire people and who turn out to be real lunatics. They probably do every once in a while, and that's okay. They've got very stable workforces, huge teams. One person's not going to disrupt a whole team. But in your case, they could well do it. So you've got to convince an investor, not to mention yourself and others, that you understand HR, you understand how to characterize what it takes to be a good team player in a small group, because every person can have a huge impact on it. You don't want to make the wrong choice. Revenue generation is a big one, of course. All businesses survive because they generate revenue, and at the end of the day, they have more left. They have some left over, I should say. And if you can't speak intelligently about that, you are not going to be seen as a latent business person or an experienced business person. There's lots of companies that never make money or never make a profit. Some get bought up because they have other assets. They might have intellectual property. They might have a good workforce. They might have a great pipeline and weren't able to monetize it properly themselves. But you should count on having a path to get to break even and then break into the black, into profitability, and show somebody that that's going to create real value, not paper value, and that you can make a convincing case that you understand what that process is. I rarely see enough emphasis on revenue generation and margin management by a startup. I don't see it nearly often enough. It's such a critical part of a business proposition, and yet people just don't pay it proper heed. The value proposition, we're going to talk about that next week. That's super important. I'm going to throw out a challenge. I'm not going to see the challenge. I'm going to throw it out. I believe each and every one of you as entrepreneurs should be able to stand up and give a 30-second clear, concise, and compelling value proposition about what you're doing that answers the question, basically meets the criteria of what are you doing and why should anybody care? Because that's what an investor's mind. What's this guy doing? Why should I care? That's your value proposition. It's not your mission. It's not your vision. It's not your elevator pitch. It's what are you doing and why should anybody care? And I think if you can answer that suitably, then you've got a good start. You've got a good start with that. Product market fit, of course, absolutely essential. People do tend to focus on that. Sometimes they do too much on that and not enough on how do I actually get the product to market? How do I keep an eye on how the market's accepting or embracing what I'm offering? How do I decide it's not working? How do I decide to try a different market? How do I pivot to a different market or a slightly tweaked product or a totally different product? You're going to encounter these things for sure, especially in most every market, most every niche nowadays has multiple players in it. if you can find a totally unique niche, you've really achieved something. It's very hard to do nowadays. 30 years ago, probably not the case, but that's not the world we live in now. Branding is a big one. I suggest you either educate yourself or surround yourself with people with strong branding experience, because not news to anybody that brands are how companies are known and where a great deal of value lies. And a way of seeing that is do something that mimics like the Coke logo. You'll get a letter from their lawyers within the hour, no doubt, telling you to take it down or face the wrath of Coke's legal team. They take branding very, very seriously. The big brands are hyper aware of any infringement or any getting too close. So understand what your brand is. What do you want people to associate with it? How do you promote it? How does your team promote it? How do you guard it? It's really, really important. Investors respond well to people who can talk cogently about what it means to create and to protect a strong brand. HR management, I mentioned that before. In a startup, you are the HR department. The HR department doesn't get a lot of love in most big companies, but you are now the HR department. You've got to show that you understand it and that you're taking care of the risks entailed in your team. It's not hiring the right people. It's not crossing the T's and dotting the I's in employment agreements, like intellectual property, confidentiality, non-disclosure. If somebody leaves, do you do things like an exit interview to remind them of confidentiality? Do you check references? All these things. This is what you have to do. And it's not second nature to most of us. So understand that the HR side of the business is as important as anything else, possibly the least appealing, the least sexy part of running a startup, but you've got to do it. And if you do it well, don't be afraid to emphasize it to somebody, to say we might make some mistakes. We're going to make mistakes, but hiring bad people is not going to be one of them. And I think that would play well, because so much disruption is caused by hiring somebody. And if you're in Europe or a place where it's hard to get rid of people, be extra careful, because it's just a burden you don't want to bear. Accounting, cash management, the finances of the company, obviously, taxation, payroll, these are things that you've got to learn about. And sometimes they're simple. Here in California, there's lots of rules and regulations. You've got to know them. If you don't, you're going to get in trouble. Negotiation and conflict resolution. What I say is people are really good at creating conflict. They're not that great at resolving conflict. So you're going to find lots and lots of opportunities to become a conflict resolution, negotiation, or mediation expert. Embrace it, but be ready for it. And then the last thing, due diligence in getting an investment. Due diligence, I'm guessing that most people know what it is. It's a very deep dive into everything they can think of about your company. The earlier stage you are, the harder it is to find substantive things to grasp onto. So you've got to tell a good story about how you're going to manage the company as you grow. If there's not a lot of substance, they got to have something to go on. And how do you survive due diligence to the point where they say, okay, you meet enough of our investment criteria that we'll put in some money. Maybe not all you're looking for, but getting anybody to give you money, if it's not friends and family generally, is a pretty good thing. You should be proud of that, but use it as a stepping stone to raising more. It's no mean feat to bring something to market, and it's no mean feat to get someone to trust you to bring something to market. So if you can do it, then good on you. Now do it again, and then eventually stop raising money and start generating your own growth, organic growth, through your own operations. The last thing I'll say about anything today, but certainly on the fundraising side, is fundraising is possibly one of the most unpleasant tasks ever devised by mankind, for sure. And I think what you want to do is raise money as much as you can, as few times as possible. Because the more time you're out there raising money, the less time you're spending building your business. And that's not going to play well. You don't want to raise money and then 6 months later, be back out on the street, hat in hand, looking for more. Raise what you need, and possibly a little more, as few times as possible. Build a business that can support itself, and away you go. So with that, thanks to everybody for coming and for listening. I hope it was useful, at least a bit of guidance around what you're looking for, how I can help, at least with some recommendations or some feedback. It's what I do. I really enjoy it. So please feel free to look for such things. So with that, I'll say thank you, and onward.